Okay.
There we go.
I think if it fails again, we just call it a day. But
Yeah,
thank you
it
for
seems like a
trying.
much better connection for me this time.
Say again.
It seems like a much better connection for me this time.
Good. Okay, so let's just stay there and let's start from the beginning. Just tell us again who you are and where you are. I'm sorry to do this again.
No, it's fine. Kelby James Russell. I'm in the Finger Lakes here. I'm the winemaker at Newt Cellars, Empire Estate as well, and the Terrasson project with Thomas Pastuzak.
And I met you when I was at Finger Lakes Riesling Camp. I think you were at Fox Run, you said. Would you mind
Yeah,
giving us your recap like you did before about your CV and how you came to wine?
yeah. So I got into wine without having a real family connection to wine, and just fell in love with, kind of like most of us do, I think, accidentally fell in love with wine, and then fell in love with winemaking, and just busted my butt doing internships back and forth across the world, until I was from the Finger Lakes originally, so there was a home connection here, and then I landed. I was at Fox Run for 3 years doing harvests, and really just loving learning from Peter Bell there. And
Mm-hmm.
then, in 2012, one of Fox Run's closest companions in the region, which is Newt Cellars, the two of them partner together with a third winery, Anthony Road, often on projects. But I went over to Newt to become the assistant winemaker in 2012, and
Okay.
then became the head winemaker in 2013, after kind of getting my sea legs under me, might be the way to put it. So I always joked that I was traded for draft picks to be named later.
So we started this conversation too. Would you speak generally about the region, why it's a special region, kind of for people who might not know Finger Lakes?
Yeah, I mean, to really boil it down, the region is lucky to. It reminds me of in the World Wine Atlas. There's a description of the Saar in Germany as being winemaking on a knife's edge, uh,
Oh,
and which is a beautiful turn of phrase, and also kind of describes the risk reward scenario, right? Like, you're risking a lot climate wise to get ripe grapes, uh, but the reward when you can pull it off is tremendous. And that's always rung true to me with the Finger Lakes as well. I mean, we're certainly different than the Saar. We have a little. I mean, we're obviously Riesling heavy, but we can do Cab Franc and some other things. But man, when we get these like long, cool falls that let the grapes ripen on the vine, there's just nothing to compare to it.
so the reason that I remember you so much is I was up there for the Riesling camp, and we drank so much Riesling. Man, your Cab Franc is the one that stuck out to me as being. I just opened my eyes to what the region was capable of. And again, I can't remember. I want to say it was Fox Run, but it might have been Red Newt. Can you explain what you might do special with Cabernet Franc, or your idea with Cabernet Franc, and give us some insight into that, maybe?
Yeah, I have a couple different lenses with which I look at Cab Franc. One is that I'm just not afraid of the green or herbal notes.
Okay.
Uh, I'm not seeking them out, right? I mean, you can find those wines as well, where they really try and dial in that green bell pepper, methoxypyrazine. But there is I think especially in the 2000s, there was a trend in the Finger Lakes to just try and cover up anything green with like gobs of new oak and anything you could do, right? And it's just not true to the fruit. Like, the fruit is so beautiful and is so juicy and flavorful. Like, to me, the savory notes are actually what make it an enjoyable food wine as well, not just like an enjoyable porch sipper. So one side of it is not being afraid of that. The other side is we have a pretty old world way of handling the fruit through and through, and kind of you wouldn't see anything else quite like it in the Finger Lakes. At this point, we do pretty much all stem inclusion. We are not. We're not. I should say, not doing carbonic, right? We're crushing the fruit, because carbonic, in a way, we tinkered around with it, but it's almost like new oak. It kind of overwhelmed the terroir of the fruit, that like cinnamon, bubblegummy aromatic.
Okay.
So crushed fruit, but all the stems included, all hand punched down, it gets about 2 months on those skins and stems, and then we basket press it off in an old wooden basket press. Uh, and that sounds like a recipe for disaster. If you talk to most people in the Finger Lakes, they'd say, the stems are going to be too green, it's going to be too tannic, or it's going to be, the wrong type of tannins, and you've got seed tannins, and that all might be true. But I realized that the red wines I love drinking, maybe it's because I had that experience in Tuscany. Italian red wines have a real bitter edge to them. Like
Yeah.
it's part of the, it's part of the culture, right? Like they love sweet and bitter things, right? It's Amaro and espresso and whatnot. And to me, it was when we kind of honed in on that bitter side of Cab Franc that all the pieces fell into place for what makes it the great food wine it can be.
That's actually really fascinating to hear. There's a cookbook called Bitter, and it talks about how in Europe, when you make a fruit tart, they let it burn a little bit, and that bitterness just adds a level of complexity, whereas the American palate wouldn't burn. It wants much more fruit and much more, and I think more sophisticated flavor that when people come to, they appreciate it, but it's not for everybody.
No, certainly not.
So can you tell us about Red Newt, the winery, and why it might be different from your neighbors, and then kind of go through the Empire Project and the Terrasson Project?
Yeah, so Red Newt was founded in 1998 by Dave and Deb Whiting. Dave was the winemaker, and he'd been already at that point in his career, had been an important winemaker around the region. Made some kind of gave the region its name for Gewürztraminer because he really believed in that grape. And I've found things from like a conference in 1988 on typewritten pages of like reports he gave on Gewürztraminer in the Finger Lakes. So he was already a heck of a winemaker. And then Deb had been doing a catering business kind of on the side of her normal job. And the property that is Red Newt came up, and it was very obviously could be a tasting room and a bistro. So the two of them launched that. 99 is when it opened. And the two of them were a real dynamic duo, it has to be said. And in the 2000s, there was a real ethos and connection to local farmers, which seems kind of like, of course now, but early 2000s, there was no such thing as, locavore or anything like that. I know Deb had to do an incredible amount of work just to get, the supply chains, the logistics didn't exist to get local farms getting you food. And she would do that and celebrate the farms. Red Newt was the first winery in the Finger Lakes to have single vineyard bottlings. There's kind of a nice parallel there between how both of the bistro and the winery treated the farmers they worked with. And it stayed that way. In 2011, Deb passed away. Dave is still the owner of the business, and is still kind of the sage advice on top. And then we have I came in 2012 and have a great crew that works with me. You've got a glimpse of Megs at some point earlier, my assistant winemaker, who's part of the powerhouse team here. That we just have a heck of a great time making wine in the cellar. It feels like we're doing things that no one's ever done before.
That's awesome and exciting, and doing it well, clearly.
Trying to have fun with it.
So then, can you tell us about, I know Thomas, and tell us about those two projects, and maybe add what it's like working with, a partner who's a sommelier and directly works with people on the street every day with customers.
Yeah. So it's Thomas came around the Finger Lakes in 2013. He'd been in Ithaca and was a real Finger Lakes fan, but he was around in the harvest of 13 with a friend of his, and they stopped by Red Newt and tasted upstairs. It was during harvest, and I remember them coming downstairs and wanting to taste a little bit in the tanks with us. And I was excited to see Thomas. He's a big name to me, but I was like, oh my gosh, it's harvest! Like, what's going on here? And then, credit to him, I guess, because that was my first vintage at Red Newt, right? I had no track record. No one knew who I was. And 2 months later, he reached out that, he was going to start this project called Empire Estate. And they really thought, they really liked what I was doing in the cellar and my philosophy, and thought that I'd be a good fit to work with them on it. So it's been a really fun project. It's a dry Riesling and a reserve dry Riesling that we make every year. I don't know if I'm allowed to spoil the surprise, but there is a Blanc de Blanc that's in the pipeline to come out, I think, later this summer as well. Will be the third wine from them. It's made at Red Newt. You know, there's a real great synergy there. Red Newt, we're just so, as a winery, Red Newt is so Riesling heavy. Even in a region that we think of as Riesling heavy, Red Newt kind of sets the benchmark for percentage of Riesling that we work with. So there's a real, just a natural fit for Empire Estate to be made at Red Newt. You know, it's a nice intellectual fit for me as well, because I get to work with, I get to source from and work with a tremendous number of Riesling vineyards in the Finger Lakes now, and really get a sense for the different terroir up and down the lakes. And, you know, it's, Thomas is just a fantastic guy to work with. You know, he's got a great palate. He kind of, you know, we talk about what we're aiming for stylistically, and then he really trusts me to push for that style, and do what I think works best for that. But then it's just such a blast to sit down with him and actually work on blending trials the following spring to come up with. It's exactly what you said, right? Like he has an insight into what the customer is, what a consumer is going to want in that wine, that is, you know, nothing that we could ever come up with in-house, right? He's pouring it and hearing the response and getting feedback from friends like you of how it shows when they taste it or show it to people. And it's, you know, that's not simple, right? It's not, we're not like changing the style year to year, but it's the tiny tweaks of like, you know what, maybe if it was half a gram drier this time, or right. You know, just, you know, you know, a lot of.
One of the things I am constantly marveling at is the number of somms you meet who are doing great things, and you're like, well, where did you start? Where'd you come from? And they're like, oh, I work with Thomas at Nomad. And so like a good leader, and so I imagine he's a good partner for you. And then what is Terrasson then?
So Terrasson is a small label for Thomas and his partner Jessica, and it's just a couple of a rosé, and then we do a Gamay and a Cab Franc red every year for it as well. So it's much smaller lots, very sort of hands-on winemaking, a lot of fun to work on, right? Like it's nice to have these small lots of reds to tinker around with. And then, you know, there's also just the logistics. It's a nice complement to Empire Estate without being in competition with it, because they're in totally different lanes. And this is, you know, if Empire Estate tries to be somewhat of an Austrian style dry Riesling, if we want to get really wonky, that's where that lines up. You know, the reds that Thomas is working on, even with the Gamay, I feel like, you know, the name Terrasson, right? Like it kind of lends itself to an Austrian sensibility.
Yeah. So is that a logistical problem or difficulty, just having so many different fruit sources and fermenting systems and tanks and barrels? You must have a good handle on Excel.
Yeah, we have a good handle on that. We have some really good software to keep track of all the tanks. The other thing, I think there's a couple things that happen. One is that we run a very particular way with, especially our Rieslings. Once they're in tank to ferment, they don't move for 10 or 11 months. We really push the lees contact. So, I mean, Megs and I, when we're talking, we usually talk about like the tank number that a certain ferment was in. We can even talk about it 3 or 4 years later, like, oh, I remember 593. Like they almost become like children, because you're like, you're tasting them every day. You're really up close and personal with them, and like at some point it becomes like a new vernacular for you to talk about that ferment and what it's done over its 10-month life. I think the other thing that's helped me a great deal, my last traveling harvest experience before I came to Red Newt was as the night shift red winemaker at Yalumba at their premium site down in the Barossa. And I mean, Yalumba is just an amazing company. I mean, they're big, but they also make staggeringly beautiful wine. And to see the winemaking team there, how passionate they were about their ferments, but to them, I rarely saw them because they were mostly out in the vineyards. And I mean, Megs can tell you, and our cellar team will probably grumble sometimes about it. During harvest, until the fruit's all in, I'm spending most of my time out in the vineyards, just really having my feet on the ground to know where things are coming from and why.
Uh-huh. Wow, that's cool to hear. Can you? So I talked to first Carrie Strong from Casa Lever wants you to talk about your Merlot, if you would.
Oh yeah. So also from this vineyard, actually kind of just down slope from me.
Okay.
It's a grape that I think we have a love-hate relationship with at Red, just because we love making it and we hate how difficult it has been to sell. Because Merlot's just got has a bad rap. But this site and really good sites in the Finger Lakes, make a Merlot that stands on its own, right? Like it's so typical with any of the Bordeaux varieties to have to blend in small parts of the other ones to kind of balance out their eccentricity. And with Merlot, that usually that you have this big juicy mid palate, but you lose out on some of the maybe the finish and length that you might like. But in a cool climate like the Finger Lakes, that ends up not being true. Like ripe Merlot here is basically a complete package. And we just, we work with it the same way we would with the Cab Franc. We kind of lean into that style. The fruit is just astonishingly that we get to work with. And I think it might be, Megs, you can nod at me if you agree. It might be probably the biggest secret gem within Red Newt portfolio. Like we will have bottlings of it that you can get through our distribution. We'll have like releases from 2008 or 2005 that are just drinking spectacularly. Like
wow.
And that's something that I don't think people likes Red, let alone Merlot.
And it's funny that it's a Somm who pointed it out rather than a consumer, because there are some Finger Lakes lovers on here. So on that point, can you talk, because Chris Bates last week when I spoke to him said, the Finger Lakes thing that you're going to start to see is there's a lot of microclimates up here. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. With the Riesling that we source, I think there's so many. We feel like us in some ways, which is probably a death knell because that's a hard region to sell. But you're dealing with such a variety of soil types as you go up and down the lake. You're dealing with east side versus west side sun exposure, which I'm usually pretty fast to say doesn't matter for Riesling in particular. It does, but it not in some huge fundamental. But it does matter a great deal for reds. And it isn't better or worse than the other, but you get on this side of the lake, which is the east side, so facing towards the west, you tend to get darker skins, more concentration, and you get more ethereal style of red on the opposite side. And then you have like a north to south gradient as well. The further south you are, the warmer it is during the growing season. The further north you are, the closer you are to Lake Ontario, which really cools things down. And then the lakes are all different as well, right? You've got elevation. Seneca Lake is at 450 feet above sea level, and Keuka Lake is at, 750 or 800. So you have, I don't know whether it's a blessing or a curse to have this just remarkable variety of terroir to work with, microclimates that respond differently. I mean, it certainly as a winery, it behooves you to have a few different sites and different. But it's as a winemaker, it's endlessly exciting.
That's thrilling. I have one more question, and then I'm going to let you go because the data's starting to happen. I'm afraid I might lose you. Can you speak to your time as a winemaker?
Yep.
I've found slowly people as the customers in the restaurant are much more open to New York State wine in the past few years. About 8 years ago, it was a little bit harder to sell. Now they're more excited. Can you talk about that as a winemaker and like where you sell around the country and how that has changed?
Yeah, so the Finger Lakes was always our big home. New York City was okay, but not great. And then maybe 5 years ago, New York City seemed to switch went off. which has been great to see. And I would say, especially for us, the reds. It used to be I almost would apologize for bringing a Finger Lakes red into an account. People are actually excited to taste them and see them. So, New York State and the Northeast are still major for us. DC's now big. Washington, or down the Mid-Atlantic, and we're around the U.S. pretty well. I think the more exciting thing for us is we're seeing a lot of interest from China and the United Kingdom. And easier for us to export our wine than it is to sell it like California.
Wow. That's fascinating. I'm interested to hear you say it about DC, because I know there's a group of somms that are like acid heads down there. So that makes sense. But overseas is really exciting. And the idea of microclimates, I think, really makes you realize that it's a fine wine destination, or just, fine wine producing region.
Yeah, there's a real old world sense of matches what export markets. I think the combination of much and, frankly, the fact that we're cold and wet feels very European.
So, as a means of saying goodbye, would you mind showing us around just one more time?
Yeah. I'll just pan. We're going from Riesling, Gris right in front of us here. Right there is Syrah, a little Syrah that we make. Obviously, looking across Seneca now, you can see the vines that are kind of.
I'm afraid we're going to lose him now. Oh, we got you back. Good. Sorry. You were showing us the regions where each of the grapes were.
Oh, great. So did I get that far?
Yep.
Cab Franc Merlot. Over that little ridge, it gets steep, is where the Cab Franc and Merlot are, and then we have Pinot Noir here, little block of Pinot Noir, and then we swing around and Meg's assistant winemaker extraordinaire waving at the camera.
Awesome. That is great. It's so beautiful up there. It's like this is the time of year to be up there, man.
Oh yeah, without question. I mean, summer's nice at the lake, but spring and fall are spectacular.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you go, but this has been really eye-opening. I love going back to the Finger Lakes because I had such a good time up there. People are so nice, but I learned so much every time I talk to you guys. It's really nice to be like New Yorkers together through it.
Yeah. I mean, we're excited for things to open up a bit. I think not to sound strange, but it seems like in these odd times that the Finger Lakes, at least for a destination that people are more interested to come to, since other field travel destinations might not work. So we're excited to have everyone.
Yeah, I hope that works out for you. Well, thank you for your time, Kelby. I learned a lot. It was really good to catch up with you, and I look forward to tasting more of your wines when I get back to the city.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Sorry for the glitches.
No, I am glad we got this long able to do it, a long data haul, or whatever you want to call it. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thanks again, man. Take care now. Bye-bye.
All right.